So yesterday we were looking at the criticism of a rationalist paradigm. So what we have said is that uh, public policy formulation through rationalist paradigm has been a failure because of the assumptions made by these thinkers. They made this assumption of linearity. That is, public policies will have a direct correlation between the inputs and outputs. But in reality, this is not the case. As we have discussed yesterday, there are so many unpredictable, uncertain variables which influence the outcomes of public policies. That is the reason why these policies formulated through rationalist paradigm, they have been mostly a failure. The best example we have given is the Planning Commission. Since the first 5-year plan onwards till the 12th 5-year plan, none of the plans formulated by the Planning Commission have been successful. Why? Because Planning Commission has formulated those plans on the basis of this assumption of linearity. As we gave the example, when the government gives money to construct roads, going by this rationalist paradigm, automatically the roads should be constructed. But in reality, there are so many hurdles: environmental rules and regulations, consent of the state governments, then willingness of the people to give up their land for construction of roads, and then political agitations, civil society agitations. So all of them are not taken into consideration by these rationalist paradigm thinkers, because of which most of the time you can see that public policies are a failure. Next criticism, as we say, against this rationalist paradigm is that these rationalist paradigm thinkers could not differentiate between what is policy and what is planning. They could not differentiate between what is policy and what is planning. Policy, as we study all the time, is the exclusive domain of political executive. Policy is the exclusive domain of a political executive, whereas planning is mostly done by bureaucracy. So they equated policy to planning. These rationalist paradigm thinkers, they have equated policy to planning. That is the reason why they demanded participation of more administrators in policy formulation. Administrators cannot participate in policy formulation, because the policy formulation, it is the exclusive domain of political executive only. It cannot be given to the administrators. This is another criticism. Next criticism is that while formulating these plans, these administrators do not take into consideration the availability of resources. Most of them are mostly what we call idealistic in nature. They don't take into consideration the availability of resources. That is the reason why when the Planning Commission had come out with bigger plans, the resource allocation was not there to implement those plans also. And most of these plans are mostly what we call theoretical in nature. Most of them are what we call theoretical in nature. They don't have any practical significance at the ground level. That is the reason why, again, this has been a failure. So that is what we say the criticism against rationalist paradigm. Ultimately, they are mostly theoretical. They are based on this false assumption of linearity, and they could not differentiate between policy and planning. Even in planning also, they did not take into consideration resource availability while formulating the plans. That is the reason why they are a failure. So we have seen the limitations of both incrementalist paradigm and rationalist paradigm. That is the reason why another paradigm had come into existence, what is called strategic planning paradigm. Strategic planning paradigm. What do we say about this strategic planning paradigm? This strategic planning paradigm is a combination of incrementalist and a rationalist paradigm. It is a combination of incrementalist and a rationalist paradigm. It is a combination of incrementalist and a rationalist paradigm. So what are we saying here? What we are saying here is that in incrementalist paradigm, we have seen domination by the political executive. Whereas rationalist paradigm, we have seen domination by bureaucracy, administrators. Both of them have their own limitations. That is the reason why it is said that public policy formulation require a combination of both. Public policy formulation should be a combination of both. It requires a combination of both. So on the one hand, we need a political executive. On the one hand, we need a political executive who brings in values, who brings in reality, which is needed for policy formulation. And on the other hand, we also need bureaucracy, who bring in rationality and facts. Rationality and facts to ensure success of public policies. To ensure success of public policies. We need a combination of both. Both of them are equally important. Political executive with its emphasis on values and bureaucracy with its emphasis on rationality. As we discussed earlier also, what is required is integration. This is what we say about in public policy formulation models. So if you look at it from 1970s to 1990s, research into public policy analysis from 1970s to 1990s, the entire research into public policy analysis focused only on policy formulation. Entire research into public policy analysis only focused on policy formulation from 1970s to 1990s. Research into public policy analysis only focused on policy formulation. And why? Because it was assumed, it was based on the assumption, that a policy which is well formulated can never be a failure. It was based on the assumption that a policy which is well formulated can never be a failure. That means if you emphasize on policy making, that is more than enough. Like what Simon Halsey has spoken about, decision making is the most important activity performed in organization. Right? But what happened during this period? Even though policies were well formulated, they ended up as a failure. Even the policies were well formulated, they ended up as a failure. Those policies ended up as a failure, in spite of the fact that they were very well formulated. They ended up as a failure. Why? Because of problems in implementation and evaluation. Because of the problems in implementation and evaluation. Because of problems in implementation and evaluation. That is the reason why from 1990s onwards, there is research into public policy analysis. From 1990s onwards, research into public policy analysis started focusing on implementation and evaluation. From 1990s onwards, this entire research into public policy analysis started focusing on implementation and evaluation. It started focusing on implementation and evaluation. This research into public policy analysis from 1990s onwards. So what we are saying is that Between 1970s and 1990s, the entire focus was only on formulating policies. That is the reason why Planning Commission had so many experts working in the Planning Commission coming out with excellent plans. But all of them have been a failure. Not most of them, all of them have been a failure. Why? Because the government simply did not give importance to implementation. They believed that once a policy is well formulated, it will always be a successful one. On the other hand, when it is a failure, what did the governments do? They had come out with much bigger programs. For example, when these programs like Food for Work program and other programs are a failure, then the government came out with much bigger programs like IRDP, Integrated Rural Development Program. So what the governments have done is that they never try to find out the reasons for the failure of those policies. Whenever a particular policy is a failure, what did they do? They came out with much bigger programs by allocating more resources. And it resulted in much bigger failures also. Right? So that is when by 1990s, all around the world, it was realized that the success of public policy depends not only on policy formulation, but also on implementation and evaluation. So there was no research in implementation and evaluation. So from 1990s onwards, the research into public policy analysis extended to implementation as well as evaluation. Let us look at what are the models in policy implementation and policy evaluation. What are the models in policy implementation? What are the models in policy implementation? In policy implementation, we talk about 4 different models. Authoritative model, then participative model, then coalition of actors model, and finally endless learning model. Authoritative model, participative model, coalition of actors model, and last one is endless learning model. Right? Both first and second are dominated by bureaucracy. The first and second models are dominated by bureaucracy. What is this authoritative model? This authoritative model basically talks about bureaucracy-centric development. Bureaucracy-centric implementation. What happens here? How the policies are implemented? It is a centralized top-down approach to policy implementation. Centralized top-down approach to policy implementation. Centralized top-down approach to policy implementation. So what are we saying here? The Central Planning Commission will decide how to implement the policies. What are the procedures to be followed? CPC, Central Planning Commission, will decide how to implement the policies, what are the procedures to be followed. And the bureaucracy at middle and lower levels, lower levels, they are not given any freedom to implement policies. Bureaucracy is not at all given any freedom to implement policies. They are not given any freedom to implement policies. And they use punishment to force the people to implement policies. Threat of punishment. The threat of punishment. Where do we find this? This mostly we find in socialistic regimes. socialism. Regime, R-E-G-I-M-E, regimes. Right. And India also had the same model during planning process. We also had the same model during planning process. During the planning process. Then the second one is a participative model. Second one is participative model. What happens in participative model? In participative model, bureaucracy plays a very significant role. It is also bureaucracy centric only. Bureaucracy plays a very significant role. In this model also, bureaucracy is playing very significant role. So what happens here? People at middle and lower levels, bureaucracy working at middle and lower levels, they are given the necessary freedom to implement policies. They are given necessary freedom to implement policies. They are also incentivized. They are also incentivized to realize outcomes. They are also incentivized to realize outcomes through rewards and awards. Through rewards and awards. So what is the difference between the earlier one and now this one? In the earlier one, there was no freedom given to the people. Everything should be done according to what the central authority tells them. And they are punished if they don't realize the objectives. On the other hand, in the present model, Central Planning Commission gives them more freedom. They are incentivized to realize the outcomes. Because people at lower level, they know the problems better. That is the reason why they are given freedom also. Both these models are what we call bureaucracy-centric models. Third one is coalition of actors model. Coalition of actors model. Coalition of actors model. What is this coalition of actors model? As we have mentioned, bureaucracy-centric development has been a failure. That is the reason why, as part of this policy of reversals, what did we do? We have opted for citizen-centric development. Citizen-centric development. So you are involving all sections of society in policy implementation. Citizen-centric development. There are basically involvement of all sections of society in policy implementation. Multi-actor paradigm. That is what we say. What are the sections of society that we are talking about here? Right? We have spoken this earlier about this earlier. You have the central government, you have the state governments, you have local self-governments, then you have bureaucracy, you have NGOs, you have civil society organizations, media, self-help groups, then private sector, then voluntary associations, then we have community-based organizations, then you have multinational companies, multilateral institutions, So all of them are now part of implementation. Coalition of actors. Everyone is now part of implementation process. Why? Because this bureaucracy-centric, state-dominated development process has been a failure. Right now what we have is this, what we call this collation of actors model. You are ending the monopoly of bureaucracy over development process. You are actively involving the private sector. You are involving the multinational companies. You are involving multilateral institutions. You are involving NGOs and civil society organizations. You are involving self-help groups and community-based organizations. You are involving media and public-private partnerships. Everyone is included in the implementation process. Right? That is where we talk about collation of actors. Right? Yesterday also, when I discussed this ethics question paper, I have spoken about social audits. This social audit is part of this collation of actors. Right? Social audit is part of evaluation. This is part of implementation. So this is what the next model is, a collation of actors. The last model in public policy implementation is what we call endless learning model. Endless learning model. Endless learning model. What do you mean by endless learning? What do you mean by endless learning? There is no end to your learning. That is your UPSC preparation. Right? Every day you study something and you think that is not enough. You keep on studying for days, months, years, decades, centuries, and ages also. From Chalcolithic age to, right? That is what we call endless learning model. So what this endless learning model says? This model says that public policy implementation is an endless learning process. It says that implementation of public policy is an endless learning process. What do you mean by it is an endless learning process? What do you mean by that? That means as and when we implement policies, we keep on finding more problems and mistakes in implementation. We keep on finding more problems and mistakes in implementation. And what do? We try to rectify the mistakes. Right? That's what we say, cyclical process. So in the next policy, we try to rectify the mistakes. Then what happens? When you implement again new policy, new problems will crop up. There is no what we call a perfect policy as such. There is no perfect policy. Right? We can keep on learning from the mistakes. And this learning process is endless because there is nothing like perfect policy. Endless learning. What do we mean by that? Let us try to understand. In 1970s and 80s, the government had come out with so many employment generation programs. In 1980s, the then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi launched two major employment generation programs. In 1989, on the eve of the birth centenary celebrations of Jawaharlal Nehru. So what are the programs that he had launched? For rural areas, he had launched a rural employment generation program called Jawahar Rozgar Yojana. For people in urban areas, another program was launched, Nehru Rozgar Yojana, NRY. So what is left in Nehru's name? Jawahar and Nehru. So then Lal. Pandit is a title, not name. So Lal Rozgar Yojana for people in Pakistan. Employment for people in Pakistan, right? So these two programs were launched. The government has allocated huge amount of monies. But in reality, they proved to be a failure. Why? Because they were bureaucracy centric, right? If you remember, all these things we have discussed in Indian administration also. There was no participation of people. There was no transparency, nor accountability. It resulted in massive levels of corruption. They are a failure. Right? So what did the government do? The government wanted to, find out the reasons for their failure and come out with the new policies that would help the government in overcoming those failures. So the government launched in 2005 a new program called NRAGA to rectify the mistakes that were committed earlier. So the government identified that the previous employment generations for programs were a failure because one, the government was only morally responsible but not legally accountable to implement. The government identified some of the reasons. First one was the government was only morally responsible. Bureaucracy and the government was morally responsible but not legally accountable to realize the objectives. Second reason was lack of participation of stakeholders. Lack of participation of stakeholders. The beneficiaries, there was no participation of beneficiaries. There is no participation of beneficiaries. And the reason was they were a failure, and the reason was high levels of secrecy in implementation. High levels of secrecy in implementation. And another reason was massive levels of corruption. Massive levels of corruption. All these reasons led to the failure of those programs. All of them led to the failure. Right? So the government thought that through NRAGA, they would cover up all those weaknesses and come out with a perfect policy. So what did the government do? First, the government had involved Gram Sabhas. Gram Sabha was asked to identify the beneficiaries. Active involvement of people. Gram Sabha was asked to identify beneficiaries. Job rosters, employment rosters were formulated by Gram Sabha so that there is a participation of people. Second, moral responsibility of the government was converted into legal accountability. Moral responsibility was converted into legal accountability. How? Through this rights-based approach. Through rights-based approach. Through this rights-based approach. It was converted into legal accountability. Through this rights-based approach. So what is this rights-based approach that we are talking about? That means it is the legal right of the people to demand compensation from the government if the government does not provide employment. They should be given minimum 100 days of employment. And they should also be paid minimum wages. They should be given minimum 100 days of employment. They should also be paid minimum wages. If this is not done, then the money should be credited into their accounts whether they are getting employment or not. That is what we say, transforming moral responsibility into legal accountability through this rights-based approach. And in order to reduce corruption, what did the government do? The government has used e-governance, digital governance, in order to reduce corruption. The government has used e-governance. How? The money was transferred into the accounts of the people directly. The money was transferred into the accounts of people directly. It was transferred into the accounts of people directly. So the government thought that it has covered all the bases. There will not be any corruption. But when it was implemented, it was found out that there was so much of corruption, massive levels of corruption. When it was implemented, it was found out that massive levels of corruption. How and why? Gram Panchayats, these Gram Panchayats, what did they do? These Gram Panchayats created fake muster, right? They created fake job cards. The members of this Gram Panchayat, they created fake job cards. For example, population of a village is 1000, there are 5000 job cards. And they use the same technology to indulge in corruption. They use the same technology to indulge in corruption. How? Bank accounts were created for all those 5000 people in collusion with the bureaucracy there. Bank accounts were created. And the money was withdrawn through ATMs so that bank officials do not get any suspicion also. For all those 5000 fake job holders, bank accounts were created, they got the ATM cards, and they used to withdraw the money from ATM. It has resulted in massive levels of corruption. And no assets were created, but the work was done, and the money was withdrawn. No assets were created, but according to the procedures, work was done, and money was also withdrawn. What we call the systematic corruption. This is what we say endless learning model. Again, you can give another example, PDS. What did the government do for PDS? To reduce corruption in PDS? Linking, Aadhaar with PDS. The government thought that they would reduce corruption. Linking Aadhaar with PDS. But what happened here? As we discussed, people are at any point of time are more intelligent than the government and bureaucracy. So if there are 5 members in a family, each of them will have one separate ration card. Rest of the 4 members will be part of the family. Are you getting the point? So 5 members and 5 ration cards and 25 kilos each. 5 members means 5 into 5, 25 kilos. So they will be getting 125 kilos of rice. Right? And it was linked to their Aadhaar also. So they will withdraw through this biometric identification also. And the government says that we have distributed food grains to 80 crore people. In reality, they have distributed food grains only to 16 crore people. Remaining 5 times is the same people will be getting food grains. Massive levels of corruption. That is where the problem is. So you are getting 125 kilos of rice at say 1 rupee per kilo. You are paying 125 rupees. Right? And then as part of this Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, you are getting another 125 kilos free of cost. So you have 250 kilos of rice. What is required for your family is only 20-30 kilos per month. Right? Remaining 220 kilos, what do? Sell in the open market. And open market price is 40 rupees. You are getting free of cost. You sell in the open market for 25 rupees also. Imagine, 200 into 25 rupees. How much you will be making? 230 rupees. How much you will be making? That is how systematic corruption. The government thought that they have removed corruption. This is what we say endless learning model. So this, as we said, public policy is a cyclical process. The feedback and that you receive from the policy, will help you to review the policy, and then this will become input, and you will come out with a new policy trying to overcome the weaknesses in implementation. And when you implement the new policy again, new problems will crop up. Again, the same thing happens. And again, you will try to overcome the weaknesses. Again, you implement it. Again, new problems will crop up. So there is nothing like what we call perfect policy. There is nothing like perfect policy. That is what we say endless learning. Public policy implementation is always an endless learning process. For example, you are writing answers. Right? The first answer you have written is 100% stupid. In a second time you write again, it is 120% stupid. Third time it is 200%. You are trying to learn. When will you write the perfect answers? Never. Right? It is always endless learning. I don't have to tell you these things about endless learning. That is what you do all the time. Right? So now, what is the assumption that we are making here? The assumption we are making here is that We are willing to learn from mistakes. But what human history has shown is that people have never learnt from their mistakes. Human history has repeatedly shown, if you look at the human history, the entire history of human civilization, we can see that people never really learnt from their mistakes. Right? They never really learnt from their mistakes. When was the last time we have learnt from our mistakes? Right? When was the last time we have learnt from our mistakes? That is where the problem is. Human history has shown very little evidence of people learning from their mistakes. Right? That is the reason why we say in English language, history first repeats itself as a tragedy, then as a farce. Why? Because of our unwillingness to learn from mistakes. In 1975, Indira Gandhi had come out with a food for work program to help poor people to have food security. In 2005, in 2014, her daughter-in-law came out with a much bigger program, Right to Food. And there is massive level of corruption in both the programs. Where is the question of learning from mistakes? By 1980s, we have realized that these public sector enterprises have been a complete failure. They are incurring losses. Did we discontinue with those public sector enterprises? Where is the question of learning from mistakes? And we know, as we have discussed, subsidies cannot provide solutions to the problems of poverty of poor people. They can only provide temporary relief from poverty. That is what we call it as poverty alleviation. It is not poverty removal. But, did we make any efforts to remove poverty of poor people in the last 75 years or so? Not at all. How can you remove poverty of poor people? Only by giving them good education and good health. Only by ensuring better infrastructure and industrialization. Only by having a tax regime that would help the investors to come and invest in our country. As we have discussed, Elon Musk yesterday, he has said that India has huge amount of taxes. That is the reason why he does not want to come to India. Our tax rate is so high. It is ridiculously high. The government is like a blood-sucking animal. It will take the blood of all these investors through various taxes. He said that why should I come to India when tax rates are such high? And this is part of what we call socialistic regime. In 1991, we said that we are liberalizing. We have reduced some taxes. And what did the BJP government do? Again, they increased the taxes. Where is the question of people learning from their mistakes? Similarly, all of us know that this war is always only for destructive purposes. But we kept on fighting wars. And we know that this terrorism can never bring peace. But people indulge in terror activities. And we know that religion is the opium of the masses. As Karl Marx says, religion is the opium of the masses. And we know that we are killing other people in the name of religion and God, which is completely wrong, unethical. But we continue to do those things. As we discussed, as we have seen in Punjab recently, sacrilege, people were killed inside the Gurudwara only. And they call it as a holy thing. Killing other people, right? Is it a holy act? Obviously not. Did Guru Nanak say that kill people if they are touching my sword? Right? Kill people if they are touching Guru Granth Sahib? That is what they are doing. And we have never learned from our mistakes. That is where the problem is. As I said, history has shown very little evidence of people learning from mistakes. So there is no question of endless learning model also. This endless learning model will apply only when we are willing to learn from our mistakes. When was the last time we have learned from our mistakes? We never learned from our mistakes. ICMR has given a guidelines that people should not be tested. That is what exactly happened in the first wave also. You are not willing to learn from your mistakes. It is said that people should always be wearing masks. They should maintain social distance. But have you ever seen politicians following these things? And most of them get corona, but they don't die also. That is the problem. That is very repeated, some time back, in the second wave, uh, Amit Shah, he was admitted in hospital ICU. Everyone was looking at with a lot of anticipation. But he came back. Even Corona cannot do anything to politicians. And Modi never got Corona. Because Corona, they know that these viruses, if they touch Modi, they will die. He's more dangerous than them. That is what. Where is the question of people learning from mistakes? Now we know that violence can never bring peace. That is what we indulge in all the time. We know that no religion has taught people to kill others in the name of God. That is what we do. Right? And when did we learn? When was the last time we have learned from our mistakes? That is the reason why we said that history first repeats itself as a tragedy, then as a farce. When you don't learn from the mistakes, it becomes a farce. And that is what is happening. We know that if we cause a huge amount of this damage to the ecology, environment has its own way of reacting. But have we learned from the mistakes? Take the case of America right now. America is under severe grip of this extremely cold conditions. What America right now is extremely cold conditions. Half of America is without electricity also because of extremely cold conditions. Why? Because why this kind of abnormal environmental climate events are taking place? For the simple reason that we are ruthlessly damaging our ecological systems. As Mahatma Gandhi repeatedly said, our earth has enough resources only to satisfy the needs of the people, but not their greed. And the entire capitalism works only on the basis of greed. And when did we learn from our mistakes? That is where the problem is. And we believe that this endless learning model can work only when we are willing to learn from our mistakes. We have never learned from our mistakes. We know that reservations are not the way to bring these backward castes into mainstream. It is not the way, because it has only benefited a microscopic minority of sections of society. It has not benefited vast sections of society. After 75 years also, if you are talking about giving more reservation, means it has been a failure. The policy has been a failure. What we have to do in the weaker sections, we have to focus on their education. We have to focus on their health. We have to focus on their infrastructure at the lower level. That we did not do. For everything, we keep on extending reservations. And that is where we have not learnt from our mistakes. That is when this endless learning model also becomes infructuous. It becomes useless. Because this endless learning model can be there only when you are willing to learn from our mistakes. As the government says, only 22% of our population is living below poverty line. If that is the case, why are we giving food grains to 67% of our population? Nobody will answer these questions. That is the reason why history itself repeated as a tragedy and then as a farce. So this is what is called endless learning model. These are all the models in public policy implementation: authoritative model, participative model, coalition of actors model, and endless learning model. Let us look at the reasons for failure of public policies. Why public policies have been a failure? We have discussed these things in development administration also, in the entire Indian administration also. We have seen all these things. Let us try to repeat all of them. Why? Because endless learning. Because you have not learnt all the things. I think I have discussed these things at least 200, 300 times, right? Or 2-3 billion times. Still you have not learnt, so I am repeating. That is the reason why history is repeating as a farce, right? So let us see what are the reasons. First and foremost, elite mass model in policy formulation. Elite mass model in policy formulation. Why public policies are a failure in India? Right, elite mass model. And second, incrementalism dominates policy formulation. Incrementalism dominates policy formulation. That means in the name of public policies, what you are doing? You are bringing insignificant improvements in the lives of the people so that the status quo is always maintained. Poor people will always remain poor. Third one is Beagle factor. Beagle factor. Right? Fourth one is complete mismatch because of this Beagle factor. Complete mismatch between the needs of people at the lower level, the needs of people at the lowest level, at the ground level, complete mismatch between the needs of people at the ground level and policies formulated at the top. And policies formulated at the top. Complete mismatch. And policies formulated at the top. Next reason why public policies are a failure. Assumption of linearity. Assumption of linearity. We think that outlays would be transformed into outcomes. But there is so much of a gap between transforming outlays into outcomes. Next, bureaucracy-centric implementation. Bureaucracy-centric implementation. Bureaucracy-centric implementation. Next, high levels of secrecy. As we discussed in Indian administration, the central government is implementing around 2,200 schemes. How many schemes people at the ground level know? High levels of secrecy. Next, huge amount of discretionary powers in the hands of officials. Huge amount of discretionary powers in the hands of officials. Then massive levels of corruption. Massive levels of corruption. Next reason why public policies are a failure, massive levels of corruption. Then line item budgets. Budget only mentions the amount of money to be spent and the expenditure. It is not linked to outcomes. Line item budgets. Next is complete absence of social audits. Complete absence of social audits. Next, absence of accountability mechanisms. Absence of accountability mechanisms. Next, colonial attitudes of bureaucracy. Colonial attitudes of bureaucracy. Next, tendency of a bureaucracy to treat people as subjects to be governed. To treat people as subjects to be governed. To treat TREAT, treat people as subjects to be governed. And not as citizens to be empowered. And not as citizens to be empowered. And not as citizens to be empowered. Next, importance is given to poverty alleviation than poverty removal. Importance is given to poverty alleviation. ALLEVIATION, alleviation. In brackets, providing temporary relief from poverty. Providing temporary relief from poverty through subsidies. Then poverty removal. Importance is given to poverty alleviation than poverty removal. In brackets, empowering people to earn their livelihood. Empowering people to earn their livelihood. Next, policies are formulated first. Policies are formulated first without defining their objectives. In brackets, irrational policy formulation. Policies are defined first without, policies are formulated first without defining their objectives. Irrational policy formulation. Next, absence of stakeholders' involvement. Absence of stakeholder involvement in policy formulation. In policy formulation. Next, complete absence of policy evaluation mechanisms. Complete absence of policy evaluation mechanisms. Due to our failure to define objectives. Due to our failure to define objectives in quantifiable terms. Due to our failure to define objectives in quantifiable terms. Due to our failure to define objectives in quantifiable terms. Next reason why policies are failure. Dominance of political populism in policy formulation. In policy formulation. Next reason why they are a failure. Political culture is dominated by only emotions and sentiments. Political culture is dominated by only emotions and sentiments. Emotions and sentiments. Right? So, these are all the reasons why public policies are a failure in our country. Right? That is what we say. I think this is more than enough, all these reasons. Right? Whenever our Prime Minister has free time, from wearing new dresses, he can go through these things. Right? So he's always busy. Right? Either addressing people or wearing new dresses. Right? Next, let us come to the next one, policy evaluation. Policy evaluation. We are looking at what are the models in policy evaluation. Models in policy evaluation. We talk about three models. We talk about three models. First one we say is policy evaluation at the stage of policy evaluation at the stage of policy development. Policy development. Second one, policy evaluation at the stage of instrument development. At the stage of instrument development. And the last one is policy evaluation at the stage of implementation. These are the three different stages in policy evaluation. Let us look at all three of them one by one. Policy evaluation at the stage of policy development. That is what we have said. What do we mean by that? What did we say about rationalist paradigm? In according to Herbert Simon, how should we select the policies or the means? First intelligence activity, then design activity, then choice activity. That is what we are saying. So what we have to do is that first identify the objectives. First identify the objectives. Right? Once objectives are identified, then you must select the policy instruments in a policy development phase. You must look at what are the alternatives available to you in terms of policies. And what you do is that you evaluate the cost benefit analysis. Right? For example, let us try to understand this with a simple example. If we are talking about removing employment or providing employment to people, that is what the government does all the time, removing employment. That's the reason why we said removing employment. So let us assume that you have to ensure what is called job-led growth. So what are the policies that are available to the government? How can the government ensure job-led growth? Yes, how can the government provide employment to people? Yes. Pardon? First one is NREGA. Right? Second one is through public sector enterprise. Third one is by investing in infrastructure. Fourth one is giving incentives to the private sector. Fifth one is through public-private partnerships. Right? So what you have to do is that at this stage you have to evaluate which is better. You have to evaluate which is better. You have to calculate the cost-benefit analysis of all of them. You have to calculate the cost-benefit analysis. You have to calculate the cost-benefit analysis. For example, take the case of this NREGA. What is the benefit and what is the cost? The benefit is that immediately you can provide employment to the people. And the cost is that employment is only temporary in nature. Every year you have to provide employment. Is that way of providing more jobs to the people? Not at all. Why? Because every year you have to provide jobs. Is it possible for the government to create jobs for everyone? Obviously not. So you have to evaluate all these options. Everything is rational. What is the cost and what is the benefit? This is what we call policy development phase. Second one is, you have decided that public-private partnership. Through public-private partnership, the government will be creating infrastructure. Through that, you are providing productive employment to people. Right? You have decided PPP. You have decided on PPP, public-private partnership. You have decided on public-private partnership. Right? Right? Public-private partnership. Now, what are the different types of PPP that you have to adopt? Should you be following this BOT? Various instruments are there in PPP. BOT, BOOT, then revenue sharing and profit sharing, then right, HAM, hybrid annuity model. These are all the different instruments that we are using in public-private partnerships. Then you have to look at all of them and select the one which can be ensuring the success of PPP. We'll talk about these things as part of PPP later. Right. This is what we say. Instrument development phase. Second. Now you have opted for HAM, hybrid annuity model. Right, let us assume that hybrid annuity model. Through this model, you are implementing the policies, right? HAM. You have decided on this HAM. And through this, you are implementing the policies. After policy implementation is over, then we will evaluate the policies finally in terms of their outcomes. The last phase is after policy implementation, policy evaluation will be done. And if you look at it, we also have other model here. For example, how do we evaluate the policies? If you remember auditing, we spoke about 3 different stages. One is pre-audit. Second one is concurrent audit. Post-audit. This is also policy evaluation. Pre-audit means, as we discussed, this instrument development and policy development phase. That means for big infrastructure projects, the government has to look at what are the alternatives that are available and must calculate a cost-benefit analysis. As we said, pestle analysis. And then concurrent audit means as and when the implementation takes place. And finally, post-audit means after the implementation. These are the different stages in policy evaluation. So this is about policy evaluation. Now, we're continuing with this policy evaluation. What do we say here? When it comes to policy evaluation, cost-benefit analysis is the one which the government mostly follows. The government looks at cost-benefit analysis for policy evaluation. Cost-benefit analysis is what the government follows for policy evaluation. This is what we say NPM also. So what we are saying here is that this cost-benefit analysis is necessary but not sufficient to evaluate public policies. This cost-benefit analysis is necessary but not sufficient to evaluate public policies. It is necessary but not sufficient. Then, what are the other parameters to evaluate public policies? What are the other parameters to evaluate public policies? How to evaluate these public policies? What should we take into consideration? If this is what we call evaluation, first one we said cost-benefit analysis. What is the cost and what is the benefit? Second, whether it is providing employment to people or not, whether it is resulting in job-led growth or not, whether it is removing inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth or not, what we call it as inclusive growth, whether it is resulting in balanced regional development or not. These are all the different ways of evaluating public policies, whether it is resulting in balanced regional development or not, whether it is resulting in gender empowerment or not. Gender empowerment or not. Of course, this is the last one. Next, whether it is resulting in sustainable development or not. Protection of environment, very important. Then, whether it is resulting in cooperative federalism or not. This is very important in a federal country like India. Whether it is promoting cooperative federalism or not. Next, whether it is helping in removing corruption or not, that particular policy. Corruption is systemic and systematic. So whether it is helping in removing corruption or not. Next, whether it is resulting in participation of stakeholders or not. Participation of stakeholders or not. Right? Next, whether it is resulting in empowerment of citizens or not in the long term. Empowerment of citizens or not. Right? Whether it results in self-sufficiency of country or not. self-reliance and self-sufficiency or not. Next, where it is helping in improving the per capita income of the people or not. Next, whether that particular policy is taking the society towards modernity or not by removing those blind traditions and customs, where it is resulting in the taking the society moving in the direction of modernity or not. Right? This is how we have to evaluate public policies. Cost benefit analysis is necessary but not sufficient. Right? Then and the most important one we did not mention, whether it is helping the political parties to win elections or not. That is what they do. So that is the reason why we did not mention. They never take into consideration all the things that we have mentioned. The only thing they take into consideration is whether it is helping them to win elections or not. Right? That's why I did not mention it. Next, proceeding further. What do we, let us continue with the analysis of public policy. What we have said is that it is the politics that determine policies. This is what we said. It is the politics that determine policies. It is the politics that are determining policies. That is what we have said. Right? But in recent times, what we have seen is changes, radical changes. In recent times, we have seen radical changes in policy formulation. What are the changes that we are talking about here in recent times? In recent times, what we have seen is that it is the policies that are determining politics. In recent times, what we have seen is that it is the policies that are determining policies due to resource constraint. These are all the changes that we are witnessing in public policies. In recent times, what we are witnessing is that it is the policies that are influencing politics because of resource constraint. What do we mean by that? So if you look at it, between 1950s and 1990s, all over the world, what did they do? Between 1950s and 1990s, all over the world, they had opted for a welfare state. And in the name of welfare state, every country provided their citizens free subsidies. Every country provided their citizens free subsidies. Right? Right? What we call political populism and politics dominated policies. Political populism and politics, they dominated policies. Political populism and politics dominated policies. And how did they finance these subsidies? Through borrowings. They have financed all these subsidies through borrowings. What we have seen is only competitive populism. They have financed all these subsidies through borrowings. Then what happened? By 1990s, most of these Asian countries, African countries, and Latin American countries, their economies have collapsed. That is what we have discussed, including India. their economies have collapsed, including India, right? Their economies have collapsed. So then what did they do? They were forced to take loans from IMF and World Bank. They were forced to take loans from IMF and World Bank. They were forced to take loans from IMF and World Bank. What did IMF and World Bank do then? They imposed conditionalities. They imposed conditionalities. And what happened? These conditionalities started influencing politics in the countries around the world, especially these countries. These conditionalities started influencing politics. That is what we are now saying. Now it is the policies that are determining politics. Why? Because resource constraint. They simply don't have the resources. You have to borrow. Like now, you can see what is happening in Sri Lanka right now. Right? Sri Lanka has collapsed. And they are requesting, look at Pakistan, what is happening. It has collapsed. And this IMF, World Bank, they said that we'll give you loans, but you have to implement certain conditionalities. And those conditionalities will become the policies. And those policies will determine the politics in those countries. And this is what about poor countries. What happened in 2009? In 2009, we have seen this global recession. Global recession in 2009. We have witnessed global recession in 2009. Right? We have seen this global recession. And what happened? Most of the European countries also have collapsed. We are talking about the developed countries. Most of the European countries, their economies also have collapsed. What we call them as pigs countries. In Europe, they are called pigs countries. They are basically called pigs countries. Pigs means Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Right? Their economies have collapsed. And what did they do? They had no option but to approach IMF and World Bank. To bail them out of financial crisis. To bail them out of this financial crisis. They had to approach IMF and World Bank. And what did IMF and World Bank do? Whatever the country they are giving loans, they always impose restrictions, conditionalities. So they said that you must cut down your fiscal deficits. You must eliminate your revenue deficits. You must reduce your subsidies. You must close down your public sector enterprises. Right? Loss making. You must, open up your economy, globalization, to private, multinational companies. You must devalue your currency. Right? And that is what they said. These conditionalities started determining politics. Greece has said that they will not accept these conditionalities. Political parties in Greece have come out in open saying that we will not accept these conditionalities. IMF and World Bank have said that if you don't accept, we will not give you loans. Without those loans, they cannot survive also. That is what we are saying now. Even in India also, FRBM legislation is there. This FRBM legislation is the one which, which determine our politics. The government says that FRBM legislation is there. This policy of reducing our fiscal deficit to 3% of our GDP, is coming in the way of, welfare state. We cannot spend too much amount of money on subsidies. That is what we say. Yeah.
How currency devaluation will work in that?
Yeah, currency devaluation, it helps the countries to overcome the BOP crisis. Why? Because with the currency devaluation, what happens? Imports will become costlier. Exports will become cheaper. So exports will come. When you are able to export more to the foreign countries, then you will be getting foreign currency. And imports become costlier, your imports will come down. So you will overcome your BOP crisis. So this is what we are saying. Right now, no country in the world can afford to have what we call unlimited resources. That is the reason why what we are saying is that now it is only the policies of IMF and World Bank and other multilateral institutions that are determining the politics of the countries around the world because of resource constraint. Because none of the countries in the world have that kind of resources. And most of them have collapsed also. They had no option but to take these loans and aid from IMF and World Bank. And they would impose conditionalities. Right? So this is what we say. Then let us move on and look at the last topic in public policy analysis, state theories of public policy. State theories of public policy. State theories of public policy. So what are we talking about here? Here we are talking about 4 important theories. In phrase theories, we have discussed all of them, but again we will repeat them. We will talk about 4 important theories. First one is pluralist theory. Pluralist theory. Pluralist, pluralist theory. Second one is elite theory. Third one is capitalist or a socialist state. Capitalist or socialist state. The last one is patriarchal state. Patriarchal state. These are all the 4 theories that we will be looking at. As I said, we have seen all of them, but we are trying to repeat. So basically, these state theories of public policy talk about how public policies are formulated in different states. How they are formulated in different states. Different types of governments. How public policies are formulated in different types of governments. First one is pluralist state. Pluralist state. So this is mostly we can see in developed countries. Developed countries. Like United States of America or UK or other countries. As we studied with RICS, all these countries right now all have heterogeneity. Earlier, 1950s, they were homogeneous, now heterogeneity. So what happens is that here in these countries, what we say here is that in these countries, every citizen has access to basic needs of life. Per capita income is very, very high. Every citizen has access to basic needs of life. And they are not dependent on the government for their survival. They are not dependent on the government for their survival. Because all of them have access to basic needs of life. Right? The public policies will not adversely affect them because they are all fairly rich. Public policies will not adversely affect them. So under these conditions, how public policies are formulated? They will not adversely affect them. They will not have any adverse impact on them. Under these conditions, how public policies are formulated is what we have to look at. So what we say here is that under these conditions, what we say is that the government will involve all stakeholders in policy formulation. They will involve all stakeholders, pluralist state. All stakeholders are involved in policy formulation. Normally, what will the government do through policy formulation? It is all about allocation of resources. It is all about allocation of resources. So, for example, you have a business community, big multinational companies. Who are the stakeholders here? Let us take, you have multinational companies, then farmers. These are different parts of, these are the different segments of the society. Then you have small scale industries. You have government employees. Right? All of them are looking for allocation. You have women. Right? You have women. Right? And you have, there's other sections of society like service sector. All of them are there. So what the government will do here? The government will ask them to assemble at one place. They will discuss among themselves who should be getting lion's share of resources in this year's budget. For example, farmers will say that this year we have seen severe drought conditions. Farmers will say that this year we have seen severe drought conditions, drought and famine conditions. So, in this year's budget, maximum allocation should be done to us, farmers. That is what they will say. Maximum allocation should be done to us. And rest of the sections will accept this demand of farmers. Rest of the sections will accept this demand of farmers. They will accept this demand of farmers. Why? Because they know that in the next year's budget, they can get major resource allocation. Next year it can be small scale industries. Third year it can be women. Like that, every year, every section of society will get opportunity to have control over resources. And what is the role of the government here? The government is basically an impartial arbitrator. The government would facilitate the meeting of all of them. It would facilitate the meeting of all of them. And whatever the decision they have taken, the government will implement them. Whatever the decision that they have taken, the government will implement those decisions. The government will implement those decisions. This is what we call pluralist state. Right? But in reality, do we find this kind of policy formulation? Not at all. In reality, it is not possible. That is the reason why we talk about the second model, elite theory. Elite theory. This is what we see in countries around the world, elite theory. As we discussed in the elite mass model, the same thing here. It says that elite sections of society are basically divided into two parts. The elite sections of society are divided into two categories. Who are they? Governing elite and non-governing elite. Governing and non-governing elite. Who are part of this governing elite? Political executive and bureaucracy. They are the ones who will be formulating policies. political executive and bureaucracy. They are part of what we call governing elite. And when it comes to non-governing elite, we are talking about rich industrialists, then caste-based organizations, religious institutions, then media, then landlords, feudal landlords. They're all part of a non-governing elite. They're all part of non-governing elite. And what does this theory says? Both of them will come together and formulate policies. Both of them will come together and formulate policies. They would formulate policies. Both governing as well as non-governing elite. They would come together and they would formulate policies. Right? They would formulate policies. And what happens when they formulate policies? It is only incrementalism. It is only incrementalism. That means those policies will only bring about insignificant changes. It is only incrementalism. They bring about insignificant changes. Third one is a capitalist and a socialist state. Capitalist and a socialist state. How public policies are formulated in capitalist state? This is what we call laissez-faire state. Laissez-faire. In laissez-faire state, the role of the government is only restricted to performing regulatory functions. Public policies are restricted only to performing regulatory functions. Performing only regulatory functions like maintenance of law and order and generation of revenue. Rest of all other functions are performed by private sector. And the government focuses only on regulating the private sector through these regulatory authorities, independent regulatory commissions. The government will focus only on regulating the private sector through independent regulatory commissions. Right? This is what we say about a capitalist state. In socialist state, the government has complete control over public policies. It performs all the functions. It performs all functions. Regulatory functions, developmental functions, welfare functions, everything is performed by only government. Centralized planning process, public sector enterprises, so on and so forth. And the last one is, the last state is patriarchal state. Patriarchy. What is this patriarchal state? What is this patriarchy? The patriarchy is basically a system wherein the head of the family will control the family. Normally, it is the male member of the family, grandfather. You have a joint family, grandfather will decide. So when the grandfather decides, what does he do? In terms of resource allocation, everyone will be given some resources so that everyone will be happy. Children, grandchildren, and then their friends, their relatives, everyone who is part of the family will be given something by the grandfather. Right? In the same manner, what we see here is that in patriarchal state, the state considers itself as a grandparent. The state considers itself as a grandparent. It considers itself as a grandparent and it treats people as children. So what will the state do? The state through public policies. What will the state do? Through public policies, the state will, through public policies, the state will try to satisfy each and every section of society. Satisfy each and every section of society. For example, there will be something for women, there will be something for farmers, there will be something for employees, there will be something for multinational companies, there will be something for OBCs. In the budget, you have something for every section of society. Like a grandparent in a family, the state also will try to cater to the demands of each and every section of society. In Hindi, we call it as Mai Bap Sarkar. That is what the government considers itself as a parent and treating people as children. So this is what we say about the state theories of public policy. This is more than enough, right? As I mentioned, almost every question in our public administration, you must be answering with the help of public policy. Today also, as I said, we will be discussing this year's question paper. In paper 1, there is no direct question on public policy, but every question will be answering only from public policy perspective. That is where it becomes very important for us to have a conceptual clarity. Right? Yeah.
In countries with direct democracy.
Pardon?
In countries with direct democracy, which
In countries where?
direct democracy.
I did not get.
Direct democracy.
Direct democracy. There is no direct democracy in the world anywhere else.
But Scandinavian countries.
They don't have. They don't have. They still have representative democracy only. They have the governments. Take the case of Switzerland. They have the prime minister. They have the governments. Direct democracy is only for very small amount of population at the panchayat level, Gram Sabha. That is very pluralistic theory. They will come together and they will take the decisions. That's what we say. So, this is about public policy. Then let us move on to the next important topic in our syllabus: administrative law and delegated legislation. Administrative law and delegated legislation. Administrative law and delegated legislation. Is there any lockdown curfew this weekend? Yes or no? Yes. Is it there? Yes? No problem. We will defy curfew. We will have class on Saturday. All of you are staying here only, I think. So what is curfew for you? In a jobless growth, right? So there is no curfew. Even if the class is at night at 2 o'clock, you will come. Right? Yes? Pardon? You are coming from? Jamia. Okay. But still, buses are running, I think.
Even metro is also.
Yeah, metro is also. Yeah. Maybe for one day you can watch it on our live for one day. Only for one day. Because, if we can give on giving holidays all the time, then, we cannot be doing the syllabus also. Right? So for one day you can watch it live. So let us look at administrative law and delegated legislation. What are we discussing here? How many of you have studied law? No one has studied law, right? Very good. What have you studied? When I ask mathematics, you will say no. When I ask physics, you will say no. When I ask history, you will say no. When I ask philosophy, you will say no. Law, you will know. What have you studied? Do you know what have you studied? In graduation? Accounts. Right. When I asked about accounts, you said no. Right. When I asked about cash-based and accrual-based accounts. Right. So, at least you know what you have studied, right? Right. Unless you have done your graduation from Bihar. There you don't have to study anything. You don't need to study anything. Right. What are we discussing as part of this administrative law and delegate legislation? We'll start with why administrative law. What is this administrative law? Then we'll talk about what is rule of law. Because to understand administrative law, we need understanding of rule of law. Then Dicey on rule of law. A.V. Dicey on rule of law. Then French concept of administrative law, which is also known as droit administratif. French concept of administrative law. Then Dicey criticism of administrative law. Then what are the components of administrative law? Delegated legislation and administrative tribunals. Delegated legislation and administrative tribunals. Then we will also talk about this reasons for growth of administrative law. These are all the things that we study here, right? A little bit of what you say legal language involved here. Let us look at all of them. So what happened here is that after industrial revolution, what happened? After industrial revolution, the countries around the world have seen the emergence of democracy. After industrial revolution, the countries around the world have seen the emergence of democracy. Right? They have seen the emergence of democracy. And this democracy led to the concept of welfare state. The concept of welfare state. It led to the concept of welfare state. So, before democracy, as we have said, the state was only performing regulatory functions, like maintenance of law and order and generation of revenue. It was only performing regulatory functions like maintenance of law and order and generation of revenue. Then with democracy we have seen welfare state. With the emergence of welfare state, what we have seen is a rapid expansion in activities performed by state. We have seen rapid expansion in activities performed by state. Rapid expansion in activities performed by state. We have seen rapid expansion. And the state was performing all activities as we discussed: allocation of resources, production of goods and services, then distribution of output, fixing prices, bringing about socio-economic transformation. All these disaster management functions, developmental functions, welfare functions, all these functions are performed by the state. And who is performing all these functions on behalf of the state? Administrators, bureaucracy. These functions are performed by the administrators or bureaucracy on behalf of the state. These functions are performed by bureaucracy on behalf of the state. Right? They are performed by bureaucracy on behalf of state. Right? Now, to perform these functions, these administrators needed certain powers also. For example, you are a police officer. To maintain law and order, you need certain powers. You are a district collector. To distribute the resources, you need certain powers. To implement welfare schemes, you need certain powers. Right? So, these powers are defined by administrative law. These powers are defined by administrative law. That is what we say. Administrative law defines the powers. It defines the powers, responsibilities. It defines the powers, responsibilities, privileges, immunities, of administrators. Duties, everything of administrators. It is a law for administrators. Administrative law is a law for administrators. Law for administrators. It not only defines their powers, that is what we say. It not only defines their powers, it also defines limitations on exercise of power. It also defines limitations on exercise of power. It also defines limitations on exercise of power. Right? This is simply what we say administrative law. It defines the powers, responsibilities, duties, functions, privileges and immunities of administrators. And it not only defines their powers but also limitations. For example, as a police officer, you have the power to punish criminals. But can you kill every criminal? Can you kill every person? Not at all. That is what we call limitations on exercise of power. Right? And why did this administrative law come into existence? Because of the demands of a welfare state. Because of the demands of a welfare state, that administrative law had come into existence. It had come into existence because this is what a welfare state is demanding. It had come into existence. Right? So, to understand this administrative law, we must know what is rule of law. Please remember, all these questions were asked in your prelims polity. All these questions are asked repeatedly in our prelims polity. What is rule of law? Why do we need this rule of law, and what is this rule of law? Right? As I said, this rule of law had its origins in United Kingdom. It had its origins in United Kingdom, wherein it is said that the king must be under, wherein it is said that the king must be under the control of God and law. Control of God and law. That is what it says. That means in dictatorship there is sovereignty of the king. There is no one above king. And in United Kingdom in the 18th century, 19th century, this concept of rule of law had emerged, wherein it is said that the king is not sovereign. The king must be working under God. But God is a mythical concept. So the king must be working under law. The law is above the king. That is what it said. Right? Proceeding further, it was A.V. Dicey, A.V. Dicey, D-I-C-E-Y, a constitutional expert from United Kingdom, who had defined the present concept of rule of law that we know. Who defined the present concept of rule of law. right? So let us try to understand what Dicey has to say about these things. What he has to say about this rule of law. To understand his concept of rule of law, we must also look at the conditions prevailing in UK at that point of time. To understand his concept of rule of law, we should also know the conditions that were prevailing in United Kingdom at that point of time. So what were the conditions that we are talking about here? We are talking about UK experiencing what is called golden age. In a golden age, what we call this was the age of Renaissance in UK. Right? And what is this Renaissance? What do we say about this Renaissance? Have you studied about it in your history? Yes. What is it? Rationality. Okay. Then what else? What is Renaissance? Pardon? Something new. Is that Renaissance? Pardon? Revolution. What is the revolution? This Renaissance movement in Europe, it had basically questioned the traditional and orthodox societies of Europe. Revival of the spirit of scientific temper and rationality. Right? That is the reason why this Renaissance movement in Europe had given maximum importance to what we call individual freedom and liberty. It had given maximum importance to individual freedom and liberty. What does it say? It says that if you are giving freedom to the people, they are perfectly capable of taking rational decisions. They are perfectly capable of taking those rational decisions. Give freedom to the people and they are perfectly capable of taking rational decisions. That is the reason why the concept of rationality had become the central aspect of this Renaissance movement. Individual freedom and rationality, sovereignty and rationality, it had become. So in a political system, it resulted in the emergence of what we call democracy. In politics, it led to the emergence of democracy. Why? Because democracy is based on rational choices by individuals, people. Given opportunity, they can take perfectly rational decisions regarding who can be their rulers, opposing this kingship, dictatorship. In economic system, it resulted in what we call capitalism. It led to capitalism in economy. What we call it as in France, laissez-faire system. Laissez-faire. Laissez-faire means, if you translate that into English, it is free will of the people. Laissez-faire. Capitalism is based on free will of the people. Then in society, it led to what we call the concept of secularism. That is the reason why French concept of secularism is different from Indian concept. Why? Because before this secularism, there was a complete domination by Christian Catholic Church over the activities of the government. That is the reason why it is said that the government has complete freedom to take decisions. Church cannot interfere. Religion should be completely separated from the activities of the state. Religion should be completely separate from the activities of the state. Let the state take decisions on its own without mixing religion and politics. And in administration, it led to Weber's bureaucratic theory of ordination, which is again based on the concept of rationality. Max Weber's bureaucratic theory. So what we are saying here is that A.V. Dicey belonged to this Renaissance movement in Europe. And he belonged to what is called a golden age in British history, Victorian age, Queen Victoria, golden age. This was a time when the popularity of the British government was at its peak. This was the time when the Britishers ruled almost every country in the world. Golden age of British rule. So, Dicey, basically made the assumption, that societies are egalitarian. Societies are egalitarian in nature, and people should be given complete freedom. He said that people should be given complete freedom to decide their future course of action. Right? Decide their future course of action. And he believed that the role of the state should be as minimal as possible. Role of the state should be as minimal as possible. As minimal as possible. Why? Because as we studied in Indian administration, the relation between the state and citizens is two-person zero-sum game. The state can acquire more powers only at the cost of the freedoms of the people. So Dicey has said that the role of the state should be as minimal as possible. Right? He believed in laissez-faire state. On the basis of these assumptions, Dicey had come out with his concept of rule of law. According to Dicey, his concept of rule of law has three important features. His concept of rule of law has three important features. His concept of rule of law has three important features. What are they? First one is no person is said to be guilty of committing a crime. No person is said to be guilty of committing a crime unless he is proved so by for a distinct breach of law established in ordinary courts in an ordinary legal manner. Established in ordinary courts in an ordinary legal manner. In an ordinary legal manner. Second one is no person is above law. No person is above law. That is, any person or every person every person, whatever may be his status or power or position in the society, comma is subjected to ordinary laws of land. He is subjected to ordinary laws of land. Then the third important feature according to Dicey is the general principles of constitution. General principles of constitution are the outcomes of judicial decisions. Are the outcomes of judicial decisions and established traditions and customs. Established, right, traditions and customs. These are the three important features of rule of law according to Dicey. These are three important features of rule of law according to Dicey. I think we can stop it here for today. Tomorrow we will look at all of them, right? And tomorrow at the same time we will meet and we will continue with administrative law and delegated legislation, right? For public policy, the study material is, of course, our notes is there, printed material. And then you can also go through Nicholas Henry, which is there in our Telegram group also. Nicholas Henry, a book, you can search it on the Telegram group. There is a topic called public policy in Nicholas Henry. You can go through that also, right? Those should be sufficient. So tomorrow we will continue with administrative law.